explain later. Hello, welcome. Welcome to this learning event, the book presentation of this brand new academic exploration of a very relevant and urgent topic, authoritarian practices and humanitarian negotiations. I hope it is visible. I'll allow some other people to join. This book is the first step to build a coherent framework to provide guidance, which allows humanitarians to help better other humans in need. And it's all the more relevant since we witness a growing politicization and securitization of aid. And I'm very pleased with all the expertise here in the room and online also, a lot of expertise to explore this topic on access. It's all on the crossroads of authoritarian practices and humanitarian access. In a minute, 3 of the authors of the book will present their findings on headlines. It's a very rich book, so it's impossible to do it in 1.5 or 2 hours. And we have some other expertise in the room as well. From the author part, we have Andrew Cunningham, the initiator of the book, I should say, and its editor. He will highlight the framework of the book and clarifying about what this book hopes to bring and how we can use it as humanitarian practitioners, and how it can support humanitarian action in practice. After that, we'll give the floor to Saeed Mahdi Munadi and Rod Mena. They wrote a chapter on Afghanistan. This book highlights, next to this framework, 5 specific cases, and each case is an example of a specific fraction in this field of humanitarian practice and authoritarian governance. And this is what one of those examples, or one of those cases, will be highlighted by Saeed Mahdi and Rod. I'm very pleased with them. And Rod was also involved in the study on Venezuela. Also very glad with the expertise from the Frontline Project, a joint initiative of IRC, INTERSOS and Stichting Vluchteling. In my words, Frontline's main goal is to improve humanitarian access in very hard-to-reach areas. And they support teams from INTERSOS, IRC and Stichting Vluchteling, and a growing number of other organizations as well. It was Frontline who noticed KUNO about this book and asked, can we maybe organize together a meeting to explore the findings of this book? So here we are. And from the Frontline team, we have 2 experts, Essie, Opoka, training and capacity specialists from the International Rescue Committee based in Nairobi, if I'm correct, and Barbara Boekhoudt, humanitarian access specialist at Stichting Vluchteling, also with us here in The Hague. Here in The Hague, we not only have the discount for the book and the cookies, so people who came here have more access to the discussion at the table, but I really would like to invite all people online as well to join in the discussion as well. My name is Peter Heinze. I'm coordinator of KUNO. KUNO is the platform for humanitarian knowledge exchange in the Netherlands. We're supported by 14 Dutch NGOs, international NGOs working in the humanitarian field, 6 knowledge institutes and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Initially, we just took 1.5 hours for this session, but reading the book and preparing this issue, it's impossible to do it in 4 hours or 8 hours, but 1.5 hours is really not enough. So we decided we could extend to 2 hours. Most of the speakers are able to stay with us a little bit longer. Of course, we understand that if people have to leave earlier, but I think we will need a full 2 hours. Also to do right to all the people in the room, especially online. I see people from Oxfam, from MSF, from the Red Cross, a lot of practical expertise is there, and also from the academic field. Also, very much welcome. Please use the chat and ask questions in the chat and raise your hand. We really would like to bring you into the discussions here at the table. We are also recording this session, but we only make a very brief summary of it. But please reach out to me if you don't like to be recorded, because I can imagine it would be nice to just pick up some of the introductions and turn it into a small YouTube video or whatever podcast. But if you don't feel like it, just let me know. We'll skip the idea of the YouTube video. I think it's time to get started with the first speaker of today, Andrew Cunningham. He has been in the humanitarian business since the late 1980s, has spent 25 years with MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières. He has a PhD in war studies from the King College London, and his research focuses on INGO, international NGO, and state relations. Andrew works as a researcher, strategic evaluator, and governance advisor for various humanitarian organizations, and is also board member of the International Humanitarian Studies Associations, and a lot more. Congratulations with a beautiful study. The floor is yours, Andrew.
Great, thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you for everybody who was involved with the preparation of this, IRC and Frontline Project and KUNO. It was very good opportunities to discuss the themes. I mean, I think from my standpoints, and I think from the various authors' standpoint, this is an impetus for a larger discussion. It's not about the book as much as it's about the subject matter, of course. But on that note, I find it, and Rod and I were talking about this earlier. I find it interesting that this has been a topic, a general topic that I've been working on for quite some time now. It's only recently that it's resonated, really resonated in any deep way with the humanitarian in the humanitarian sector. This is something we did funded by MSF. We did a special issue of disasters more than 10 years ago. Never really very interesting special issue, but it never really went anywhere. I did my PhD on this. I have a first book on the same subject 8 years ago. Never really resonated too much, but suddenly with this, there's a lot more interest. So it's an interesting question to me in this trajectory of the research and interest in this subject. Why the humanitarian world is a little bit more interested in this issue now. I'll leave that aside for a separate discussion, but I find that interesting. So I don't have very much time, so I just wanted to mention three things that I hope that's brought out from the book. One is in the title. I mean, humanitarian negotiations, obviously, we've all struggled with humanitarian negotiations since the inception of humanitarian work. But what we do, what is the more developing topic is how do we deal with difficult governments? So we have used lots of different terms over the years: strong states, authoritarian regimes, what have you. But what the search, I think, has been to find a way for humanitarian organizations to conceptualize what authoritarianism is in relation to our negotiations, to develop a better framework for figuring out how to deal with governments in our negotiations, especially difficult, hard governments. So the book is focused on authoritarian practices and the concept of authoritarian practices, and I think this is the key. Instead of looking at what we often did before, we looked at used the normal sort of international relations or international politics framework to look at, a liberal democracy or a military dictatorship or a hybrid regime or authoritarian regime or a totalitarian regime. We looked at regimes, but we didn't look at the actual practices. So the concept of authoritarian practices really hones in on the idea that there are practices that every government uses that are authoritarian in nature, and you have to, for a whole discussion about what that means, read the book. But there's a style of authoritarian practice which is applicable to all governments. I mean, I live in the UK, and many of the practices of the UK government right now are quite authoritarian in intent, even though we would not call the UK government an authoritarian regime. Some work that we've been doing with in MSF, we looked at the example of Italy, for example, the authoritarian practices of the Italian government in relation to humanitarian actors in the central Mediterranean, and the criminalization of aid and aid actors. I mean, these are authoritarian practices, though we would not call the Italian government an authoritarian regime. So we focus on the practices. I think it's quite essential to focus on the practices. That opens up the discussions to a wide range of different types of governments. So it doesn't matter where you are in the world, whatever government you're dealing with, you focus in on the practices which make it difficult for you as a humanitarian organization to negotiate access. And in general, these are around constriction of civic space. And so it's not just about humanitarian actors, it's about civil society organizations and the decreasing space for civil society organizations, international or domestic, to actually operate freely in the country. So that's one point. The second is in the book we used a micro, meso, macro sort of conceptualization, because it's important to look at humanitarian negotiations happen, and that's the, humanitarian practices are implemented at the micro level, at the project level. So you have, a project coordinator or, a person responsible for humanitarian action at the field level in the local area, who of course then face a number of challenges of negotiating access and bear the brunt of, authoritarian practices at that level. But then you have that at the national level, and you have it at the regional and the international level. So it's the chapters explore the micro, meso, and then the macro level to look at how authoritarian practices exhibit themselves at all levels. And then there are some thematic chapters on the humanitarian negotiations and the ethics of negotiations, and a first chapter on the MSF experience with authoritarian regimes. So that's I think that's not just for the organization of the book, but in general, it's good for organizations to really realize that, they have to look at the different there's different levels of analysis that needs to be done when they're thinking about how to react to authoritarian practices. And just the third point, in the book, we used the concept of commentaries. So each of the chapters had a commentary. So there is the practitioner or the academic who would contributed the chapter, and then we had peers who would then comments, adds to, disagree with, add a complementary sort of opinion on the content of the chapter. And I think that's an interesting way to do it, because it makes it more of a dialogue between peers. I think that was my 8 minutes.
Already?
Yes. Was it?
We can take some more.
I can take some
Yeah,
more.
I think so. You just started to highlight the framework of the book. So the
Okay.
main findings, please.
Okay, so I mean, obviously from a humanitarian negotiation standpoint, whatever type of governments and whatever type of constraints there are, those are always going to be difficult to deal with as a humanitarian actor, especially if it's an international humanitarian actor. Because you have a different space as an international actor than a domestic actor who actually is embedded in the civic space of a country. So there are a number of interesting things to look into. One is it's quite fascinating to me how whether international humanitarian actors actually perceive themselves to be civil society actors or not. Because there's this international civil society sort of that's a space that international actors inhabit. The international community or the international humanitarian community, the sector, the humanitarian machine. But then there's, when international humanitarian actors are working in a particular country, do they feel that they're actually part of the civil society of that place? Because that sort of changes the dynamics when considering what the relation is to the authoritarian practices. Because when INGOs are negotiating, are the negotiations happening from the standpoint of the perception that the organization is outside the civic space of that country, and therefore are an exception? This humanitarian exceptionalism that we shouldn't be brought into these constraints in the country because we're international actors. And how much, the chapter, I think maybe that came out in the Afghanistan chapter, and many of the other chapters is this identity of especially international humanitarian actors, and how they actually they perceive their relationship to the governments as outsiders or as somehow part of that political system. So I find that an interesting. I find that an interesting issue. If I had another half an hour, I'd go into the issue of we focused on authoritarian practices, but there's also I should say that we took this concept from Marlies Glacius. This concept of authoritarian practices was from the academic Marlies Glacius, who also talks about illiberal practices. And if authoritarian practices are about civic space, illiberal practices are about human rights. And so then that's also, there's a certain dynamic between authoritarian practices, humanitarian actors, and illiberal practices, which is also a fascinating topic, which I don't have time to go into now. I think that's probably.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Yeah, already very concrete issues you raised here on the table. Not only the framework of the book, but also the difference between authoritarian regimes and authoritarian practices. I can recognize it. There are even governments like the UK or Italy or the Netherlands could also operate in an authoritarian way. And also the difference between civil society is human actors. Do you perceive yourself as civil society or not? I have an history in journalism and as in a political NGO, and I always say civil society is highly political. But when I talk to some of humanitarian practitioners, they always say we are also for international solidarity, which should be something like a political issue as well. But I can really understand that you, as humanitarian practitioners, do not perceive yourself as civil society, at least not as political. That's interesting issues. Are there any questions for clarifications? Otherwise, I would like to move on to the next speakers. It will be a duo presentation on Afghanistan, because the next speakers will be Rodrigo, Mena, and Syed Mahdi Munadi. Syed is Syed Mahdi Munadi. I hope I speak out your name in the proper way. Mahdi, lecturer at Sciences Po in Paris, political science. He is a fellow focusing on the Central and South Asian region. Mahdi served as an Afghan diplomat in China and conducted research as a director at the Strategic Force Center Studies of the Afghan Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And as a fellow, involved as fellow in several institutions, published many books and articles on Afghanistan, China, also on issues around terrorism. Rod is assistant professor of disaster studies at the International Institute of Social Studies here in The Hague, a part of Erasmus University. Also one of the academics involved in the Humanitarian Studies Center, recently started here in The Hague. Your research focuses on humanitarian responses and risk reduction. Also too much to clarify, you publish on a lot of work around ethical, safety, security aspects of humanitarian work. I think the floor is to both of you on Afghanistan, please.
Thanks so much, Peter. I will start. So thanks also, Mahdi, to my co-author, and Andrew for inviting us to be part of this process, and to Peter and the Frontline Project and everyone for hosting us. It's a real pleasure for us to present a little bit of the case of Afghanistan. And actually, I would like to start with a brief introduction that actually we take this opportunity to engage in authoritarian practices, as Andrew was saying, as practices that are not only the solely realm of states. So even NGOs can be authoritarians in these places because there may be some less regulation. Many actors practice authoritarianism. So the question is, who is authoritarian, how the authoritarian, and who is negotiating with whom? So it's not only the state. And the second level of analysis of us, it was actually what Andrew was saying about the micro, local, meso, regional, and macro national level of analysis. And this is something that's quite interesting because in previous research and published work that we have on, in the case of South Sudan and in Colombia, we use these categories and they work really well to understand humanitarian negotiation and practices. However, what it was really interesting to learn in these other cases is that the micro, meso, and macro level are not only about where the negotiation happens. It's also about who is sitting on the table, so who is negotiation, and really important, what are negotiating, what is being negotiated at these zero levels, and how they frame these negotiations. So we tried to bring this kind of complexity into the case of Afghanistan. For example, at the macro level, the national one, it was quite interesting because not only the case of Afghanistan, but what we have learned from other cases and we try to understand here, is at the macro level, interesting enough, everyone sitting on the table, they frame, it's not always real, they frame the decisions as transparent. You know, they frame the decisions as we're only focusing on providing assistance. Because at that national level, even if you are the Taliban, anyone, if you are the SPLO in South Sudan, you are being observed. So you need to present that what you're doing is transparent, is well decided, is open on the table. That is not always the reality, and some things are negotiated beyond those big tables. At the meso level, it's a bit different, because we need to understand that all these negotiations are being translated from one level to another. So whatever we decided at the macro level, then it needs to be translated and reinterpreted at the regional or meso level by the organization that have to do something about it. And in that case, it's not anymore about being transparent, because they're not being observed that much, to be honest. And the only observations come when they report back, you know, or when they have a meal monitoring evaluation process, but they're controlling a lot of the narrative. For them, what is much more important is accountability, as I said, for the meal process and others, but it's really about efficiency. So how, with the few resources that we have, we negotiate with others to be able to do what decided on top to be done. And in reality, in that process, they reinterpreted a lot what's really going to happen. But when it comes even further, I don't want to say down. I don't like this idea that macro is up, but when you move to the micro local level, the negotiations are a bit different. And what people negotiate and people talk about is much more about what is feasible, what can we really do. And it's not about actually efficiency, as we said before. It's more about efficacy, and that's a really small difference, but it's really, really important when they negotiate on the table. It's not anymore about what we can do with the resources that we have, it's what we can do in relation with others in the content that we have. And that makes a whole difference. So we try to bring this macro, meso, and micro analysis, not only of where the negotiation happens, but also what is negotiated and which actors, to the case of Afghanistan. So yeah, now I want to pass the floor to my co-author Mahdi, so he can share more about what we found in each of these levels in this particular case.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo. I thank everyone for making this presentation possible. I just go directly to my presentation. Afghanistan was the case of this article, a country under the control of an authoritarian or totalitarian group look like Taliban, complex ethnic and religious population adhere to traditional value, restriction on women's right to work and study. Taliban emphasis more on that. And at the same time, when Taliban took over the country, half of GDP was before the Taliban was relying on foreign aid. So at this time, people were suffering. So therefore, the primary goal of humanitarian negotiation in Afghanistan was to deliver humanitarian assistance to more people while upholding international principle and preventing the Taliban from seizing control of aid distribution. During this process, some women defenders expressed concern that aid was empowering Taliban and called for aid to be conditional on Taliban behavior. However, it was not possible because there was millions of people who were in deep needs and they need aid. So it was not possible to make the aid conditional. So as Rodrigo emphasized on three-level, negotiation has started at macro level. Representatives from UN and other international organizations and regional country and Taliban be there, they have started negotiating. So UN and other organizations were willing to provide aid without Taliban condition, but Taliban wanted control over aid distribution and opposed female worker and aid organization, where Taliban finally was successful in banning women from the team up organization. But at the regional level, some regional countries often provide aid directly to Taliban for distribution. This was somehow helping them to guarantee their political security and economic interest with Taliban. At meso level, negotiation involved between Taliban ministers and representatives with aid organization. So as the history of aid and negotiation on aid in Afghanistan, always quiet diplomacy was an important for communicating with Taliban, even with Taliban 1 and Taliban 2. When Taliban leaders were more, but they're thinking that there's secrecy and there is no media on the ground, so they were more helpful. So in this case, we could see that the decisions were based on perceived Islam tradition and Taliban local representative and interest. So different Taliban administration had different policies, and some sectors look like health. They have been operating a little bit independently in Afghanistan. At macro level, representatives from various local actors, including NGO, UN agencies, and local officials, private companies, mosques, and civil organizations were involved in adaptation of decisions from higher level, dependent on cultural and knowledge and understanding of local information. What can be perceived from all three levels in the conclusion of this part? It was evident that levels of negotiation that was decided at the top, it was renegotiated at each level. And actors at each level, they needed to renegotiate the decision. And the more they were going on the lower level, so knowledge of local information and cultural and ethnic tension getting more and more important. So to have more people on the services and helping them, so they had to just renegotiate and talk with more people on the ground. So with this, I would ask Rodrigo to continue with the last conclusion. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Mahdi. And taking over from what Mahdi was saying, actually one of the things that caught our attention when we're writing this, analyzing, is for a lot of people, it makes a difference when you have a theocratic authoritarian regime, that ideology-based authoritarian regimes at the level of the state. So that's a distinction that not a lot of people pay attention to. But it's different when the motivation is much more theocratical, based on moral standard, than when it's an ideological agenda, because geopolitics play a different role at the macro level. And that also means that the translation from the macro to the meso, the micro, interesting enough, in the case of Afghanistan, what we learned is that most people expected, and I need to say something that I forgot to say before. We studied this in Afghanistan just after the fall of Kabul. So that was when the Taliban just took over. And that has changed quite a lot today. So we were saying maybe it doesn't apply anymore, and maybe it didn't apply much even before the fall of Kabul. But in that initial state is when we focused this. And in that moment, most people thought it's an authoritarian regime. And that means that all that is decided on the top level will be implemented on the ground level. And that's a conception that most people think. And most people think that authoritarian regimes are really good in making decisions and these are implemented. But the reality is far away from it. And this is also really important to understand. And in Afghanistan, it was really, really clear that what was decided on the top was, as I said, much more political. What was implemented was completely different on the ground. So it's really important for NGOs and humanitarian actors to understand that difference. You know, what they hear that is being decided in one place doesn't mean that it's that what they're going to be implementing. And negotiating and translating and navigating that space for maneuver is one of the main challenges for humanitarian actors, definitely. Because most people think that humanitarian, and this is something that we learned also in Afghanistan, that most people thought not only is quite direct the decision-making process, but second, they thought that people were really tied to decisions. You know, this is what he decided, this is what we need to implement. In reality, most humanitarian actors on the ground, they think that they have much more liberty than actually in less authoritarian places. In places where the ministries, because they are functional, they are less level of fragility, you have much level, you know, you have a functional ministry, you have a functional state, a representative, you have a functional municipality level. So there's much more levels functioning to really oversee what you're doing. But in these places, everything's so fragile and so fractured that people on the top will not really know what is happening on the bottom. So it's actually give much more liberty than what people really expect. And that's one of the main challenges, what to do with this liberty. And if I know that I'm not going to be doing what others are saying that I should do, what should I do? And how this will be presented to others. So that was also an interesting learning process. I want to leave it there because of time. But yeah, thanks again, everyone. And thanks, Mahdi, again, for joining me in this adventure of understanding better this process.
Thank you both for diving into Afghanistan, the case study, the specific frictions. For instance, on the discrepancy between what was decided in the central level in Kabul and what's being done, implemented at the local level, which gives more space to operate at the local level, perhaps. But maybe it can also work the other way around. I think Kabul more is more stable than the local situations, but I'm not sure. Also very clear about the contradictionality between if you want to fight for women's rights, for instance, and the Taliban says we don't want women workers anymore for NGOs, that maybe there's an incentive to make conditions to humanitarian aid and saying, hey, we're only giving aid if you go along with it and allowing women to work in these situations. But at the other hand, people are dying or starving and are really need. So it's a harsh contradiction. Thank you so much. I don't see any questions for clarifications online. I check on the table if there are any questions for clarifications. Otherwise, I'd love to proceed to the two people who already took a dive into the book and prepared first reflections for us, Essie Opoka and Barbara Boekhoudt. I think we thought Essie would take the floor first. Is that okay? Essie, are you ready for it? Okay, please,
yes.
The floor.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Like Peter introduced, my name is Essie Opoka. I work for International Rescue Committee as a training and capacity specialist. And my role actually is to provide trainings in capacity building to different IRC country programs. I've actually read through the book up to the end. And I must say, the book is really very inspiring, especially for someone like me who is always in the search of new knowledge and practices and understanding in the field of humanitarian negotiations. Like said by my previous colleagues, actually, we know that humanitarian negotiation is a very, very important aspect of humanitarian action. And we all know at the same time that there's very little attention that is given to humanitarian negotiation. Like Andrew said at the beginning. And I must say, I'm very glad that Andrew and the team actually have come up with a book that we all able to look into and then be able to, you know, look at the knowledge and apply it to the actual situation on the ground. So thank you very much, Andrew, and the writers to the book. It's a very good book. So having worked actually in different countries and different contexts where and still support the team in this particular context, you know, where we have authoritarian practices and illiberal practices. And at the same time, you know, we need to provide services to the people affected by the conflict or natural disasters or whatever humanitarian situation it is. I've actually come to realize, you know, from the book as well, that, you know, it is actually very important, like the previous speakers said, to align, you know, look at the different levels of negotiations, whether it's at micro, like, you know, it's been pointed out in the book, in the cases of, you know, Afghanistan, Syria, China, and Russia. But then also it's important that you come down to look at the regional level. And in this case, what specifically actually struck me in the book was, you know, at the micro level, in Western Ethiopia, actually, where we see a lot of authoritarian practices happening, and, you know, and humanitarian space is shrinking. At the same time, the humanitarian needs are really very high. So as well as in this book, it helps, you know, humanitarian organizations that do humanitarian negotiations with authoritarian regimes to be able to really understand, well, a lot of focus is being made at the micro and meso levels, but very little actually is done at the micro level. This is simply because, you know, every context has its own different challenges and different practices. So we have to be very careful in analyzing and understanding, you know, how to be able to negotiate and still, you know, keep our humanitarian operation in these areas. So when I read the book, actually, I specifically dwelt on the case study of Ethiopia, where, you know, actually the authoritarian practices that are happening, and at the same time, humanitarian organizations or humanitarian community, you know, has to adhere to in order to be able to provide humanitarian aid. Like the refugee camps that are in the western part of Ethiopia, you know, it's the operation is literally controlled by the governments, and it's for international humanitarian organizations. When you come into the country, you have to register, you know, at the national level, then you have to go to the regional level, and before you go to the micro level or the field level to implement. And at all these levels, there is humanitarian negotiations that take place. And it is very important. The lessons learned actually from this literature or this book is that it's very important to do analysis, proper analysis, context analysis at all this level. And thanks to Andrew again and the team, I picked out, the discourse analysis framework that I think not many of us are currently using. We do the context analysis because we're saving lives, we're running up and down. We don't take a lot of time to, systematically do a proper analysis and then understand what do the authoritarian regimes actually think about us as humanitarian organizations. What is the language that they're using that describe us? What is their perception, about humanitarian aid or humanitarian response in their particular areas or countries? We've seen actually sometimes, they use languages or they make speeches or they conduct activities that indirectly tell us, wanted here, or, they're suspicious about us. But at the same time, to know that, there are humanitarian needs, there are people who are dying and they need our services. So this helps us to analyze and come up with the proper narrative and say, okay, if the authoritarian government actually probably wants us to do clearance, so we have to start by registering when we come into the country. And then, we have there are issues to do with permits for you to go to the refugee camps. You need to get a permit to be able to implement the services. And this mainly apply, to the international humanitarian workers. But at the same time, to realize that, at these three levels, there's a lot of, uncoordination. They are not very coordinated. So we have to do negotiations at all levels, right, from the meso to the micro level. And we've seen actually the book clearly gives a very good case study of, in Ethiopia, where there's what they call the grace. That is the opportunity to do the appeal. When, maybe you've applied for a registration and it's taking long, you can still be able to negotiate with the authorities, at the field level and say, hey, look, we've registered and the services the refugees are in their need of services. So if you can allow us to provide. And sometimes when you do that, there are cases where we've seen, they give you, in principle, they will say, okay, yeah, provide the services, and they're able to negotiate with you. But all this from the book, actually, it's based on the relationship that you develop with this authoritarian regimes or the leaders. Again, what I picked that I need to emphasize as well as a reflection in this discussion is that, it is actually very important that we look at, the little opportunities that exist, because I know some people come in to say that, okay, we are, working with authoritarian regimes, and these keep on coming up. There are several challenges actually that are involved when it comes to negotiating authoritarian regimes. For instance, like in Ethiopia, there are cases like, staff safety, then looking at ethical issues like, are we really adhering to our humanitarian principles of being independent or impartial, or neutrality? When we go by the directive of the government, they tell us where to work, how to work, what to do, who to serve. But at the same time, we try to look at that, analyze it with the humanitarian needs. Should we just say no and walk away, or should we be able to compromise? So this actually, the book also looks at, the compromises in hard to reach areas. What are the things that as humanitarian organizations or community that we are willing to be able to sacrifice or compromise without necessarily, crossing our red lines or, going beyond what we are expected to do. We've seen cases where humanitarian organizations pull out of a situation, but then you look at it and say, okay, if we pull out, how about the people who are dying? What is it that we are ready to, give that is dear to us, but at the same time will make us have, maintain operation space and still be able to operate in this particular country? So there's several lessons that we can actually learn from this book. And the key takeaway that I really want us to reflect on, and I think it's for everybody, probably it will come up during the discussions, is that what is it, that as humanitarian community that we are willing to compromise? That at the same time, does not really outweigh the needs or the humanitarian principles or the impact that we want to provide. Because we are being looked at like complicity, compliant to authoritarian regimes, because we work within their policies, we work within their directives, follow their procedures. And yet at the same time, we say we are neutral, we don't excite, and then we say we are impartial. The government is telling us who to serve, where to go, and what to do. So it is very important that we look at actually all this and weigh the cost benefits before we do compromises. But at the same time, if we don't compromise, we're not going to be able to, reach the people on the ground with our services as well. But at the same time, we should look, when working authoritarian regimes or the government, it's mainly what we do is we label the regimes, like Andrew said. We mainly label the regimes, but without necessarily looking at the practices, because even the governments that are not labeled as authoritarian, they have authoritarian practices. So if we analyze this actually properly and look at the practices and try actually to engage or develop engagement strategies that will help us address the challenges that are imposed by these regimes, it's better than, just coming in to level them without necessarily understanding, because they equally have, just like us, they equally have their own reasons. They don't trust us as humanitarian community. They have security reasons, always the reason they want to control us, but then they will reason it in terms of security, in terms of sovereignty. So how do we as humanitarian, organizations that are trying to find space to be able to access the people in need, be able to create that understanding and relationship with the authoritarian regimes and still be safely provide, the services to the people affected by conflict. And another question that I would really, or reflection that I would really want as humanitarian practicing organizations to look at is, we actually say, we make compromises. We dwell so much on international framework, and then, we look at domestic laws and all that. But what is it that we know about, when we go down to the micro level, about the context, about the culture, about, the interest of these authoritarian regimes and why, they behave the way they do. So understanding our interlocutors or the counterparts actually helps us a lot to be able to see what we're able to compromise. And if we cannot compromise, we shouldn't be afraid to say no. And at the same time, but all this requires actually a lot of analysis and hard decisions to make. And one thing that is very important, we are not very, coordinated. We're fragmented. We all have our interests as organizations. And this also at the same time make these authoritarian regimes look at us like, probably we have our own agenda, hidden agenda. We have our, we interfering into their sovereignty in their operations. So it's very important that, if we look at ourselves as well and see as humanitarian community, what, we're able to compromise, how we coordinate, how we speak, how we behave, and how we create that relationship. And at the same time, not afraid, to say, okay, things that will make us cross our red lines, just pause and say no to them and find an alternatives. So I'll stop there. This is my reflection on the book and the actual practice on the ground. And once again, thanks to Andrew and all the writers of the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm very glad to learn that it is really useful for your practitioners. Not giving a framework to do the analysis, but also the language to describe what is going on the ground, and to make this very difficult the decisions about what kind of red lines do we want to hold up, what kind of what are we willing to compromise? That was your key takeaway, your key questions. What are we willing to compromise, and how can we understand those authoritarian regimes, authoritarian parties, which we have to deal with to make these kinds of decisions. Thank you so much. I saw Andrew scribbling and writing, but maybe first go to Barbara and then to Andrew. Is that okay? Okay, Barbara. And please, people in the chat, we have over 25 people in the chat or online. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat already. Thank you so much. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So my name is Barbara Boekhoudt. I work as a humanitarian access advisor here at Stichting Vluchteling. I'm really glad we're having this conversation today. Thanks everyone for being here. So in my work as access advisor, I work with our partners, with country teams in complex contexts like Iran, Venezuela, Syria, where teams are faced on a daily basis with these authoritarian practices. So I looked at the book from that lens as an advisor. How can I use the content of this book basically to support teams on the ground, to improve their approaches to humanitarian negotiations, and yeah, how to practically apply the knowledge that was compiled in this book. And just to go back what Andrew said in the introduction, I very much like the focus on practices, because when working with field teams, I don't think they are worried that much on a daily basis how the regime they're working with is labeled. It's really about the consequences and the practical effects of that matter, and the behavior, the attitudes the team needs to deal with on a daily basis. So I think from a practitioner point of view, this angle makes a lot of sense. Then I think it's interesting as well that all the speakers referred back to this micro, meso, macro level, because that also very much resonated with me. Because that causes a lot of uncertainty. Having to negotiate at these different levels is what makes this really complex, I think. It creates confusion. We don't know where to invest our time and energy to build relationships, and yeah, creates a lot of uncertainty for our teams. Just to give an example, I'm working a lot with the team in Venezuela, and in Venezuela, the UN Office for Human Rights was expelled from the country about 2 weeks ago. They were accused of internal espionage. And that was a decision that was taken at the capital level in Caracas, but also at the regional level. Our teams have to deal with the consequences of that. At regional level, our teams really noticed a different interpretation. Some governors really took that as, okay, now we should be careful, even more careful for all international actors, and felt that as kind of a threat to humanitarian space as well in some states, whereas in others it was interpreted in a very different way, and our teams were not really feeling the impact of that decision so much. So yeah, interpretation at different levels, I think, makes it uncertain. And also like the what you were referring to, Rod, the liberty we have at local level. I think it's often also tricky for teams to estimate how much power our counterparts have at local level. And I think sometimes we overestimate that power as well. I think that was reflected in one of the chapters of the book as well. How much time do we invest at that local level? How much space can we create there? Or should we go up at the other levels as well? And I think it's really important to understand and analyze all these levels to develop your negotiation strategies and approaches. Another topic that really stood out to me is also the importance of the underlying motives and interests of in this case governments, right? So for example, in Venezuela, we rely a lot on ad hoc agreements with the government. So our teams, international staff, literally work on tourist visa. We have very ad hoc agreements also with regional health authorities, for example. At local level, it's there's a lot more possible, but at regional level, authorities basically don't pick up the phone. They don't want to meet us, and that's the way it is. But then it's really interesting and important, I think, to analyze why it is. Why are they not picking up the phone? Why don't they want to see us? Do we indeed present a threat to us by signing an agreement with us? Do we then recognize that there is a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, which is something they don't want to acknowledge publicly? So doing that analysis, I think, is very important. And working with teams, we always ask, how are we perceived? Are we accepted? Are we seen as an enemy or a threat? Or and I also picked up on the issue of having discourse and narrative analysis as part of your broader analysis. And I found it quite helpful in the book that there was actually, a summary of how to do such a discourse narrative analysis. And I would also love to hear from other people in this room and online if there are people that have used that, if there are experiences working with that, to analyze how we are perceived in a specific context. That's really interesting to me. Then two last points. Something that was not pointed out in the book so much was collective negotiations and how collective negotiation approaches can serve as a response strategy to authoritarian practices. By basically presenting ourselves with one position as a front, I think sometimes that can be really helpful to respond to some of these practices. And it would be, to me, really interesting. And I know Klingendahl is also, really interested to research that a bit more. But what are the conditions under which collective action occurs in when we're faced with authoritarian practices? Maybe looking at the severity of these practices or the level of threat that is perceived by humanitarian organizations. But also looking into the effectiveness of collective negotiation approaches when responding to authoritarian practices. Also looking at barriers, what is holding us back from negotiating as a collective. All these type of questions, I think, would be really interesting to explore a bit further. And then finally, I basically think we shouldn't forget to look at ourselves as well, and not just point the finger at these authoritarian practices, because I think there's a lot that we can improve in our approaches to negotiations. We did an after-action review with a team in Yemen, and we concluded that we were too slow, that we didn't respond to the questions we received from authorities, and there were quite a few steps we could take to improve further. Another example, when engaging with a team in Syria, they had been negotiating for 1.5 years with a specific line ministry, and there were a lot of changes within that ministry, so lots of staff turnover. And that really led to a lot of frustration by the staff, and understandably so. But it also reflected in their attitude when they were sitting at the negotiation table with these new staff from this line ministry. So I think that attitude wasn't always even productive to actually move the negotiations forward. So that kind of internal reflections, I think, is also really important when discussing this topic. And yes, I think I will leave it here, and really curious to hear from the others as well.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you. Also to reflect on our own role and how we can improve. Also the issue of collective negotiations, the micro, meso, macro level is very useful for you. And the underlying motives of governments, I did write down. How are we perceived by governments? But you didn't answer the question, how do you perceive yourself? Do you perceive yourself as civil society, as Andrew asked in the beginning? Maybe we can get to that later. I think we first go back to Andrew. Is that okay? Many questions were put on the table, but also a lot of compliments. So
I'll just mention that I picked out three things that are, I think, good to mention. One is, I mean, obviously every context is different. I mean, that is a truism that's often said, but it's it's very important that every context is different. So it's essential to understand each context. International humanitarian organizations are not very good at that. There's often a generic way of operating which does not take into account the language and the culture and the history. So it's one of the things, especially in the MSF chapter that it's co-wrote. I mean, we talk a lot about that humanitarians tend to take a look at the situation as it is today, rather than looking at the narrative that's been established in society, not just governments, but in society about humanitarian actors over often a long time. And to take that into account, because that informs the relationship. It's not just about your relationship with particular people, today. It's about the history of the engagement between the society and the governments to humanitarian actors over time. So every context is different, but it's important to have a sort of a mental model into how you approach, in this case, approach governments. And so that's why this sort of thematic or framework, like looking at authoritarian practices is interesting, because it gives you a mental model that you know what you're looking for. And so you have a frame of reference, and you have a way of analyzing a context specific to each place you're working, but you have a standard sort of way of analysis. So that's one thing. The second is discourse analysis. Yeah, it's not exactly a common methodology within, or consciously, it's not a common methodology within humanitarian actors. So I think unconsciously people do that as individuals. You read the newspaper, you listen to the radio, you talk with people, and you form an idea about what the narrative is by hearing the discourse. But it's not often done in a very systematic, structured way. But I think it's very valuable to do that, because then it's a proxy. You're not going to get you're never going to have a meeting with governmental representatives where they're going to sit across the table and tell you, this is exactly what we think of you, why we act the way we do, and this is our plan of action and our strategy for managing you. Nobody's ever going to say that, so you have to find proxies. And discourse analysis is a good way, because it gives you an idea about what the state's view is, because we often look at what the state is thinking through ourselves. We always have that our own selves as a lens through which we're looking at the state. Discourse analysis, actually talking more with governmental government representatives, etc., to actually get the state's view rather than our view of what we think the state thinks. So in the MSF research, I mean, we did not talk to international humanitarian actors. We did not talk to ourselves. We only talked to governments and representatives of governments and their proxies to get their view, to get as much as possible their view directly about. And then you can know what you're doing wrong. I mean, because then you look at yourselves and you think, wow, we're not managing this relationship very well, because we do not understand what the other side is actually thinking. And so that's essential. But just the sort of the national local thing, often people who are negotiating access at the local level are only dealing with the immediate issues which they need to solve in order to get the job done, which is understandable. And that's sort of at the tactical level. But one thing is to look at the strategic level, because some issues could probably be, sometimes issues can be dealt with at the higher level once and for all. Well, not once and for all, not permanently, but if you're having constant bureaucratic obstacles put in your place in your way at the local level, there maybe is a reason for that at the higher level, at the national level. And maybe with a better strategic understanding of the government's problems that they have with humanitarian actors, you could actually negotiate and solve some of these issues at a larger level, so you don't have so many smaller issues to deal with. Those are my 3 points.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Anything like to add, Rod?
No, at the moment, no. I agree with the comments of others, and yeah, I'm glad also to hear that a lot that have been said in the book also resonates. Yeah, but it's true. It's something that we need to talk more about it. We talk more about, we have a better narrative of the big discourses and what it went well, and less of the everyday practices, everyday nasty thing that they don't work well, and all the challenges that we face openly, not internally only in the organizations, as you said, to have these lesson learned shared. I think that's also an important, I want to take away that take from Barbara and Essie also.
It's also shared via the chat. Some colleagues have to leave already, but also from the Red Cross, as you clearly the signal, we really need to discuss more, because it's so important that we don't do it enough, these kinds of reflections. So I will try to check also with Mahdi. Mahdi, would you like to reflect on any of the remarks being made during the session so far?
I just want to add this, somebody who's coming from Afghanistan dealing with a lot of communication on different levels. I would say that a country which there is no structure, a firm structure, so definitely groups, ethnic groups, local leaders, they are somehow important for decision making. Even sometimes when we do have a group, a totalitarian or maybe authoritarian group like Taliban, that we think, as Rod was telling, that we think that it might be very capable of dominating everyone. Even that is not capable to just say something that everyone accepts. So in that case, in a country look like Afghanistan, which structure is not very implemented in society, so you have to deal, translate, renegotiate things. For example, when I was in Afghanistan, whenever we had warlords who were coming from different regions, so they had their own way of communication. So I think the only one who was able to deal with them was Karzai, the previous president, that he was communicating with each one with them with their own language. So with that, Tim, I think it is also applicable for humanitarian negotiation in Afghanistan, and definitely all three levels that we have applied. And I appreciate Andrew for the TEM and Ruth that they have brought the TEM, and it was really applicable for the negotiation that was taking place in Afghanistan. I thank everyone for the presentation.
Thank you, Mahdi. And also would like to check with Essie and Barbara if you have any further remarks so far. There are no questions yet in the chat, or we'll check in the table. Thea has a question, but Essie or Barbara, any remarks from you, or shall we just move on to Thea? Essie?
Not really at this point. I think I would be really curious, to hear also from the other colleagues, especially for me, the case studies that Wolf mentioned, and then if what they think, my interest would really be to know what do they think really about the compromises in hard to reach areas. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The compromises issue.
For me, it's fine. Yeah,
Yep.
let's go.
Yeah, we first go to you.
Yeah. Can you hear? Am I close enough?
There is a second microphone over there, so it should work. Thea Hillers from the International Institute of Social Studies, for those online. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Andrew. Thanks. Sorry, I wasn't at the beginning of the presentation, but I know your book, so I hope you can forgive me. I have a question which is entirely perhaps a slightly different question, and that is in the discourse of localization. So we talk about localization, and the idea would be that increasingly humanitarian actors work through national service providers. Now, those national service providers are very often the same CSO NGOs that are now confronted with the shrinking of civic space, meaning that they are also very often being curbed, curtailed, etc., etc. I've come across several issues in the past few years where I felt that international humanitarian community was not abiding by its localization mandate, in the sense that yes, they use all kinds of organizations as subcontracting, but the moment those organizations get into trouble, they're nowhere to be found. They don't stand up to advocate, they don't stand up to protest, for example. They don't use their clouds to actually help to protect those people that are also part of humanitarian space. So I don't know if you can talk about this particular issue, because I wasn't here the first half hour, but I really wanted to ask you if you recognize what I'm saying, and better what you think, is this a problem at all, and if so, you have a recommendation. How can we get the, like, there was this one example, it wasn't even authoritarian, but I was really shocked in Greece when the Lesbos authorities closed Pikpa, I think it's called. It was a really nice, lovely reception center for refugees. And then everybody's talking about localization. They all refer refugees to the Pikpa center. When Pikpa was threatened to be closed, OCHA, zip, UNHCR, zip, nobody said a word. And that would have been without risk because it's Greece. So, thanks.
Yeah, and really everybody's looking at you.
In my introduction, one of the points was actually it's to ask international humanitarian organizations, I think, often don't feel that they're part of the civic space. You know, they think they're part of the international civic space, but they don't feel they're embedded in the national civic space. I mean, I asked that question to my MSF colleagues once, as a broad spectrum of MSF colleagues. Do you think that MSF in a particular country, that when you're working in that country, that's MSF is part of civil society in that country? And zero, nobody said that it was. And the reason is because, well, we're an international organization, you know, and maybe we partner with other organizations, Ministry of Health or you know, other organizations, but you know, that's their problem. You know, there's a limit to our responsibility for others that we work with. Of course, many other organizations are partnership organizations, and they work much more closely with partners. But I still don't think that I still don't think that international actors feel embedded enough into the local civil space and feel the effects of the constraints in a way which makes them better able to see the perspective of their local partners who are in a much different circumstance. Once in a while, international NGOs do get caught up in this. I think Afghanistan, and some of the research that we were doing within MSF on Afghanistan, it was quite interesting that why was this issue about the policy of the Taliban basically to stop any engagement by women in society, not just working for NGOs, but basically take women out of society, public space. It's because, again, this idea that international organizations and their partners are used to dealing with the bureaucratic policy constraints, the authoritarian practices, which make it difficult to actually implement operations. But international humanitarian organizations don't normally bear the brunt of human rights abuses, illiberal practices. So the practices of governments to constrain the human rights, the human rights of individuals, which is often at the cause of or linked to the humanitarian crisis in the first place. But in the case of Afghanistan, international humanitarian actors were suddenly asked to participate in the human rights abuses against their own staff. And in order to maintain access, they had to be complicit with the illiberal practices of the Taliban regime against their own staff. And then they were basically then became a part of the civic space, and they did not deal with it very well. So short answer, no, there's still this, you know, localization is one of those issues which it sounds good to sort of provide more funding, more resources, more responsibility to local actors, but if the international actors do not feel that they're part of the same space, and then they share the risks, they share the opportunities, but also the risks and the vulnerabilities of those actors, that they somehow feel that this humanitarian exceptionalism applies to them. And then it's not a deep localization.
So I see, there's also other examples, and more in the informal sphere. I just met last week a director of programs, and somebody was arrested from one of the agencies she worked with, and actually she spent a year almost for her spare time to get her children out of prison. So I also know those kind of stories. So let's not only be negative, but it's rare for the people now.
There's also a comment here in the chat from Will Edmund from MSF. I'm just asking him whether he would like to pose the question himself. I hope he's able to do so. Will, would you like to join the conversation?
Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you quite well. Please pose the question yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting and interesting conversation. I haven't read the book, but really enjoyed the chat. Just wanted to touch on something Essie mentioned in her comments, just about how we think that this might impact our our sort of status as impartial and neutral actors when you can only access one side of a conflict. Particularly, I'm thinking particularly in terms of, for example, Russia, Ukraine, right? So you have you have authoritarian practices that are sort of hindering humanitarian service provision heavily on the Russian side, and that really builds into this sort of narrative of us being sort of pro-Western organizations. I'm just interested if you can talk a little bit around that kind of dynamic, because I can see that this might sort of be a big issue, well, an escalating issue moving forward. If there's any sort of comments around that you could make.
I've been talking too much.
I've been talking too much. Any from the other colleagues from the INGOs, MSF experience, for instance, you have Stichting Vluchteling, ex-MSF.
Well, it could be at this meeting.
Essie, everybody's looking at you now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Will, for the question. And I think I was actually looking at other colleagues as well to hear what they think about the compromises. For us as the International Rescue Committee, actually, I think our partnership system is very clear that when we talk about localization, we work with partners and we do capacity. We don't just transfer risk. We make sure we share the risk and we build the capacity to do that. And when it comes to compromises in terms of humanitarian negotiations, like you said, Will, this is something I mentioned when I was reflecting on the book as well, because we work with these authoritarian regimes. We sign MOUs, we get these permits, we go to the areas where they want, we coordinate with them, and I like what Andrew and the team put in the book, what they call actually mopping up, and then looking down and propping up, with the regime, authoritarian regimes, because we are only looking at providing services and our mandates, and not thinking at other aspects of our humanitarian foundational principles, like impartiality, like neutrality. So I would think this is something that I can't answer here, but it's I would really pose it for reflection as humanitarian community. When we're compromising, are we, like Barbara said, are we really looking at ourselves and understanding and saying, okay, like for us who are international humanitarian organizations, when we provide services, yes, there are a lot of suspicions from authoritarian regimes, especially in other parts, like you said, where is your funding coming from? What is your interest? Why are you here? Is it really humanitarian services that you want to render, or is it that you're here to spy on the regime or to get information? So how do we ensure that we do a proper discourse narrative analysis and understand and know exactly the perception of this other with the regimes on us, and then try to create strategies or engaged in a way that we are fully understood, and learn also from our practices, the failures where we've not been able to do right. If we're making partnership, how do we make sure that we do them meaningfully? And when we're talking about impartiality, we're talking about neutrality, how do we make sure that when we're engaging with authoritarian regimes, and then we have probably de facto governments, or we have armed groups in the area where we provide the services, and then maybe the same authoritarian regime is abusing rights, and then we're working with them, and then we still say, oh, we are neutral. So this are actually the questions that I posed, and because in reality it's not what it is. We say it, but then how do we translate this into our practices in principle humanitarian action? So it's actually a question that I would really pose back to the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, I still think it's difficult because when you look at Gaza, for instance, I understand the impartiality, the neutrality that is meaningful to get access to certain situations, but there must come a point where you, as humanitarian organization, might say, "Oh, this goes so far, we can't. This is beyond any conditionality. We just stand up." And the only organization in the Netherlands that spoke out on behalf of Gaza was, for instance, Pax and Oxfam and the other organizations whose name I now forget. Oxfam is, of course, a much more political organization, but they also describe themselves as humanitarian organizations. And from the humanitarian side, I think it's very, very, very quiet about what is going on in Gaza. So when do you start complaining about Gaza, for instance?
Not for Gaza, but I want to
please
answer to Essie.
What is your name, sir?
I'm Manu Altenbach.
Okay.
I'm an ex-MSF.
Yeah.
I'm in the company of my old good friends. I want to just unpack a little bit and maybe be a little bit radical about compromises. Not Gaza, because Gaza is a very, very sticky subject that we don't want to probably go in there. But for me, when we are negotiating humanitarian access or humanitarian, in order to compromise, you need to know what your principles or the grounds that you're standing on is. And if I may say, in the last 10, 15 years, I think as humanitarian organizations, international humanitarian organizations, we're kind of losing that principled approach to humanitarian assistance, and we're getting more towards the idea of survival modes in many of the organizations because, again, I will put MSF apart probably because of its financial independence, but many of the organizations are bound to make those funding opportunities a reality so that they are going to be able to survive as an organization and in those kind of locations. So that means, by definition, we're actually losing that principled approach from the beginning, and then you're actually compromised already. Today we talked about Taliban imposing, like not using women in Burundi. The government since 2015 is imposing that you would have a quota of Hutu and Tutsi staff in your organization. Some organizations left the country, nobody heard about it, and many of the organizations are still there. And they de facto accepted this imposition on them. And then in 2013 or 14, I think it was NRC who did the study in Central African Republic, and among the NGO workers to ask about what they know about humanitarian principles, they were not able to name the 3 principles in one go. So I think we need to reflect on ourselves right now to say, as humanitarian organizations, how are we dealing with our principles and how are we dealing with these kind of difficult situations? Sometimes we might have to be in there, and that is a compromise that if you're from a principled approach, you are going to be able to make that compromise maybe. But if our compromise is to say, I have to be there because the donor says that I need to tick the boxes of these log frame and I need to deliver the results, then we're already compromised.
Yeah.
And
What
let's
do you
not
mean
talk
with we
about
have to
that.
be in there? You say sometimes we have to be in there. What do you mean with that?
Because we need to be close to the problem to be able to speak out.
Yeah.
And that is a conscious choice of an organization.
So you need to speak out.
But again, we're talking about individual organizations now. As an international humanitarian community, we are not in unison.
No, true.
And therefore, somebody's action actually compromises also the rest. And so there's no great answer. I haven't read the book and I was late. I'm sorry for that, Andrew. And I cannot complain about the traffic in The Hague, but so sorry about that. But I think it is an important distinction. And for Barbara's question about like how do they perceive us, not an answer to the authoritarian regimes, but in 2012 I did a study in the Democratic Republic of Congo about the perception of the humanitarians in the eyes of the armed actors. And the answer was mixed. The answer was that, you know, a lot of the time they would like to see the humanitarians as do-gooders, but at the same time, we were looking at them to say, oh, they're the armed groups, they understand nothing about humanitarians. Actually, they knew a lot more than we thought. And so again, what Andrew said about, we perceive them and we think that what they are, but actually we need to dig into it a little bit more to understand what they do. But in the same study, which was very shocking to me, about 50% of the organizations, or more than 50% of the organizations that we interviewed, to say, do you negotiate access with the armed groups? They said no. And this is DRC. DRC is a place where you can actually negotiate access. And they said, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the knowledge, and we don't have the resources to be able to do these negotiations. So interesting stuff that can come out, but sorry, I can go on, but see, I made it more confusing, I'm sure, for you, but I think we need to be a little bit more critical about ourselves when we try to find solutions.
I think
Sorry.
Benoit wanted to respond and Rod wanted to respond.
No, just, hey, Will, by the way, good to see you. No, because you specifically asked also on Ukraine as a case study, and I find it a very interesting one because probably at macro, meso, and micro level, we are all making mistakes from the principled approach. And I think first of all, when you were saying also about the donor framework, let's say, I mean, yes, it's a financial game as well. I think a lot of donors have seen NGOs in Ukraine and many other countries as an implementer of their foreign policies, right? So from the beginning, it was to NGOs, international, and definitely local organizations. They're all united to support Ukraine in the fight against Mother Russia, right? It's a very Cold War. We're back to the Cold War situation whereby NGOs are actually force multipliers, like actually it happened in many places in Africa also during the Cold War. Okay, but that's the reality. I mean, NGOs, they want to survive, and I think some of them are doing better than others. But so that's the reality. I think that defines a bit, the space you work in. The question is, how is the narrative that as an NGO you use yourself? I think what's interesting has been when you use that element, for example, most of the refugees from Ukraine went to Russia, and that's hardly known. It's like they all went to the West because that fits the narrative that Ukraine wants to join Europe, and all the people fled to save Europe. No, it's not true. Like, I don't know the figure now, but it's over 500,000, if not 1 million, that went to Russia. Nobody talks about that. I'm sure these people are not in happy places in Russia either, that will also use humanitarian work. Very few donors or organizations or even donors, they talk about what's happening in currently government-controlled areas, Donetsk and Luhansk, where the situation is extremely dire. And then you should talk about it, saying from your needs perspective, you say, okay, even if we're not there, the limited information that we have would force us from a principal way to try to go there, right? So I think that's also in your own narrative as an organization, like where should we or should we not work? And a lot of the situation in Ukraine is not pleasant for a lot of people, but compared to many other crises, funding-wise needs, it's a bit of a distortion. And actually the needs are in government, Russian-controlled areas. Then going a bit closer, I would say, to the local level. I mean, it's also interesting that Ukraine government makes it impossible to do cross-line. I mean, the Russians probably don't make it easy either, but it's from the host country already that it says you cannot work or deliver aid in Russian-controlled areas. So the whole principle of neutrality is becoming impossible by your hosting government. Nobody talks about that. Nobody pushes back to the government saying, hey, actually, from our mandates, from our principles, we should be able to work there, regardless if you could do it in Russian. So I think it's also the narrative that we use our organizations is important. And then at the smallest level is, some organizations have still tried to grow cross-line. And in the beginning, when we started as Stichting Vluchteling, the first day we okay, let's put a humanitarian access advisor in the teams locally. But then also we gave up because it was actually in the end too complicated. And so at the micro level, we said, even if you could, and then the accountability and the monitoring and the compromises would be too big to have independent aid. So we in the end gave up. So, but I still think that we need to talk about it. So even if in the reality right now cross-line is not possible, even if negotiations through Moscow to reach from the other side, it's not possible. Still, I think the narratives needs to still be there to say, look, the needs are there. We should have the imperative, we should have the principled approach. I think that's now largely missing. Yeah.
Okay. There is a question also from Lila Koenig for Rod, and Rod has to leave in 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Please.
So you wanted to put something at the table as well, and maybe you first ask Lila to pose a question, then you can do. Lila, are you still with us? Can you join the discussion?
I am. Hi.
Hello, welcome. We see you.
Thanks a lot. Hi, thanks so much, everyone. This is Lila from Klingendaal. I haven't read all of the chapters in the book, but I'm learning a lot from how you're reflecting, and I did read parts of the book. And thanks a lot for the reflections from all of you so far. And my question is not so much about the internal ideology, etc., which I really appreciate listening in on how you're reflecting. And chapter 9, I thought, was quite an interesting way to categorize how organizations can position themselves towards what compromises they can or cannot make. So I thought that was very helpful in the book. But I was interested in a comment that Rod made about the different ways to think about why, and both Essie and Barbara and Benoit are reflecting on why are they authoritarian or restrictive or in denial or whatever. And you made a comment that said it's theocracy or ideology, and that really matters because the geopolitics around it is very different. And I thought that's really worth unpacking a bit more, because I wonder if there's a link between how you relate to the ideological or theocratic justification of authoritarian practice as a humanitarian organization, and whether that is something that either disables or enables organizations to make compromises or even to join in a collective stance vis-a-vis what they find acceptable or unacceptable of the authoritarian regime. And I know this is quite an abstract question, for which I apologize, but particularly at the end. But I thought it was such a, I mean, it struck me, and the comment stayed in my mind. And so maybe there's something more to discover about this kind of justification and linking it to what space to compromise there is, and maybe how organizations can rally around a particular stance. And maybe that's easier or harder when there is a theocratic or ideological justification, or maybe it's also how the humanitarian diplomatic world around it positions itself, what space and what room to maneuver you get from those donors. Maybe that's also a pertinent question right now to ask. Also commenting on what Andrew said, that like, why is this so interesting at the moment? And I think there's more to unpack there. So I wanted to invite and ask Rod if he could expand a bit on that comment, because I think there's more to discover there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lila. Thanks so much, Lila. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question and good comment. And I think in your question, there is also a lot of the answer. But this is something that we need to unpack more, to be honest. This is something that we didn't have the time to unpack more, but we discovered, and also because I also was part of the comment on the case of Venezuela, that this geopolitics is important for many actors. You know, the Taliban, they don't want to have power for geopolitical or for ideological and for political reasons, where the case of Venezuela is different, or the case in this case of, if you want to go, we don't have Ukraine and Russia is another case. But definitely something that a lot of people said, and I don't have yet much clues to say how they are different beyond the geopoliticals. So that's the only one that we found, or that I'm able to see that people were always naming. Yeah, because when it's based on politics, there is geopolitical agendas on top of it. When it's theocratical, there is less push from the international donor, the less push from other actors, and they understand it more as an internal struggle when it comes theoretical. How that unpacked beyond that, to be honest, I haven't studied yet, and I haven't been able to unpack. So I think part of your question is the answer that I think something that we should start unpacking much more, to see not only that authoritarian regimes are different at different levels, but also that there are different types of authoritarian regimes, and who define them as an authoritarian. What does it mean to be authoritarian is something that we still have a conception that I think is from the political science studies of authoritarianism, 20 or 30 years ago. I think we really unpack what is to be authoritarian today is completely different. With the forefront of technology being authoritarian is different, with the use of media being authoritarian is different. So there are many things that we can unpack. And in that sense, coming back to what Barbara was saying about how we perceive or what we were saying before about compromises, one of the important ones that we saw in the case of Venezuela, but in others, is the compromise that in many of these places, when you are close to authoritarian actors, not necessarily regimes or states, many times you will need to provide assistance, aid, whatever you want to call it, hand in hand with them. So the government will say, okay, you can work, but you will deliver together with me under my logo. Or you will work in this area, but I will be accompanying you. And that's one of the main compromises, because it's what in literature and academic terms we use many times is the concept of the instrumentalization of aid. So many of these authoritarian actors at different levels, sometimes not happening at the national level, but sometimes happening at the really local level, they have the power to impose this instrumentalization of it. So they use aid as an instrument to boost their own image, to say, hey, we are supporting people to gain legitimacy. But for aid actors, it's a big compromise. How am I going to be perceived if I work together with these other actors? Am I legitimizing authoritarian practices? But if I don't do it, I don't provide aid. So that's one of the big dilemmas and compromises that we have seen. So this instrumentalization of aid, and hand in hand with it, the politicization of aid, as you were saying. So it's not only that I compromise and I let aid to be a little bit instrumentalized, it's also that because of the politics around aid also become much more political. And this politicization of aid opens a new Pandora box of dilemmas and compromises of these regimes. And I will need to excuse myself because I need to leave to catch a train, but thanks again, everyone, for inviting, and thanks everyone for the comments.
Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and then Andrew, it's just.
My name is Piero Gandini. I'm ex. I think one of the issues that I'm reflecting now is also the short-term vision that we as humanitarians and human rights activists we have. And that's big game changer because all these authoritarian regimes are there longer term. They know us and they know everything for long term. And the humanitarians is changing and nobody follow up properly things. So we don't allow ourselves to be known and to know the reality enough to be able to cope with different movements. So we're talking about collective negotiation. Again, we do it in a hurry because we need to deliver today the humanitarian aid we need to deliver. So I think the mind shift in seeing more in long-term perspective could be one of the issues that we should work more.
Thank you. I think Andrew wanted to. Yeah.
On the previous question, I also like to take a look at the geopolitics and the political aspects of these things. But I think we should not forget that geopolitics is not only a materialistic, hard politics, not only about that, but it's also about changing social norms. I'll use an example. I mean, I was in doing some of the Afghanistan research, which not really in the book, but it was part of the MSF research. We took a look at sort of the historical narrative, changes in the historical narrative within MSF and how we reacted to the policies of the Taliban. Because what we see today is not very much different than what we saw in the 1990s. But our perception of and our interpretation of and how we reacted to those policies has changed over time. And one of the explanations for that is not that the organization has changed per se, but the societies within which the organization is embedded have changed. So the social norms and in the West about women's rights have changed. About the importance of that issue, that's changed. We saw the same, a lot of the same policies, Taliban policies in the 1990s, but our societies and what we were, the sort of the norms, societal norms that we were embedded in as humanitarian actors did not demand and did not put high in the list of priorities these issues. It was just sort of, well, that's a terrible thing, but we'll just ignore it because we need to provide assistance. But now you cannot ignore the rights of the women's rights in Afghanistan. And that does informs the geopolitical context within which we work, because it's not a static, geopolitics is not a static thing. It is informed by changes in narratives. And as societies change and the narratives change, I mean, we can take a look at the war in Ukraine, for example. I mean, this how Russia interacts with relates to the West now. Russia is it's an existential crisis. It's that they feel that it's an existential crisis in a part of Russia that there is a war against Russia by the West, not because of from Cold War style geopolitics, but the values of the West are intruding onto the ability of Russia to be Russian. Yeah. And that's a societal change. Yeah. The geopolitics, which informs the geopolitical context, and humanitarian actors change with that because we're not static entities. So we change with the times, even if we don't realize that. So I think it's not only about geopolitics, it's about social norms and how those inform the positioning of humanitarian actors as part of our societies, especially Western societies, in the changing fields within which we work.
If you frame it like that, humanitarian organizations are very much part of civil society.
In that way, exactly. Our own, MSF Netherlands is part of the Dutch civil society. I mean, obviously. Yeah. Clearly, it informs the ambitions and the reactions of that organizations to what we see in the field, and that changes over time.
Please, anybody, any further reflections? And the chat is now a little bit silent. And maybe online or here on the table, people would like to give some. Yeah, who?
I would like to
somebody. Yeah,
this is Mahdi. Yeah.
Mahdi.
I would like to just say a couple of words about the question of Lila, who has touched about totalitarian and an authoritarian somehow system or regime. As we have seen in both systems, they are trying to control. But whenever we talk about totalitarian, it's not just talking about controlling politics, but controlling the culture or the way of people living, even the way of people who are wearing. Now, when I just call Taliban as a kind of totalitarian regime or group, because it's talking about the way that you have to have the way that you have to wear, the way you have to just cut you or shave you or shave not. You do not shave your beard. So I would say negotiation in this condition, it becomes so difficult. So definitely the type of negotiation will be difficult, but at the same time, that's really important that whenever we talk about this system, totalitarian, authoritarian, these are systems that they're not applicable 100% in countries look like Afghanistan, or fragile country look like the other countries similar to Afghanistan. They are names that has been given, but definitely they're not a system that apply to all societies. So for that reason, that we have to renegotiate and translate the decision always at each level. So it's my response to that.
Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you. I'm just checking here and checking online whether there are any further questions, reflections. Lila says very true. The chat. Yeah, Bernard, please.
Yeah, if no one else.
Yeah.
No, I think that the case study of Afghanistan is really fascinating.
Yeah.
Because when Rod presented, or Mahdi, you presented saying that when the question on women participation in the work of NGOs became an issue, then NGOs were forced to become part of civil society or civic space. And it was interesting that there was a lot of different ways of reacting, and indeed, what you said, like the human rights has become more prominent compared to the 80s, and a lot of organizations said, well, you know, also from where we come, our mandates or values, it's either with women or we're out. But it was a bit very bold, I was thinking, because it also implied that you were able to impose to the Taliban that they would change course. And there was a little bit of a blackmailing logic, which I think for negotiations is not necessarily an approach that I would recommend, because it was a bit all or nothing. And then you had on the other side, you had more the pragmatic that said, look, you know, we may be a bit more humanitarian and human rights. Well, it's important, but that's not what we fight for. And maybe you're also pragmatic, thinking, well, we're not going to change them at macro level, at capital level. But then indeed, locally, there was a lot of wheeling and dealing that made it so possible. It was just very interesting to see those two approaches, which then in the end, everybody more or less states. That's but I think the initial response on, yeah, how do we look at human rights in Afghanistan from within the humanitarian work that we do? That was just an interesting, for a case study, very interesting as well to. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm just checking one more time. Otherwise, I'm going to do a final round with all the people that opened up the discussion. Barbara, Essie, and Andrew, and Mahdi also, of course. Rod already left, but I don't see any further questions now. Let me check with Essie first. Are there any final reflections from your side? Things you would like to unpack further, or lessons you would like to take with you, or whatever?
Okay, thank you very much again. Thank you it's very useful to hear, you know, insights from everyone on the topic. Just my last reflection is, you know, with humanitarian negotiation, I think we really have to analyze carefully and understand the kind of, you know, authoritarian regime that we're dealing with, and still be able to adapt. We have to negotiate. That's something that I always say. When we work, whether we work with authoritarian regimes or not, we have to provide humanitarian services to the people affected. So we have to find a way of negotiating, and in some circumstances we'll make compromises. And I still, you know, insist that we really need to do a cost-benefit analysis. We cannot just run away from negotiating with humanitarian regimes. We have to do it. We have to do it in a way that we feel does not again deter us from principal humanitarian action, but we're still able to do it safely and reach the affected population. And at the same time, it's a long time process, and we cannot just, you know, rush to do it. We need to plan accordingly and understand, and then develop the appropriate strategies of engagement. So that's actually my takeaway.
Thank you so much, Essie. And thank you also for being with us. Barbara, any final reflections from your side?
I thought it was a really rich exchange. And yeah, I was just reflecting on your comment on the needs for long-term investment. And I think that's very true. I think that needs, and it also builds a bit on what you said, is first having those conversations internally within the team. What are our parameters for negotiation? What are our principles in this specific context? How do we apply them? And then plan your negotiation approach. So I think the long term, and then figuring that out for your own organization first, and then trying to do that as a collective. I think that indeed needs very long term planning. So yeah, that's my final reflection. But I really enjoyed the exchange. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you also for reaching out to KUNO to do this together with Frontline this session. Mahdi, any final reflections from your side?
Thank you so much. I don't have any other thing.
Thank you so much for being with us. Okay, thanks a lot. Andrew, the last words are for you. Famous last.
Yeah. Well, one thing which I think is interesting to note is that we shouldn't overthink the concept of authoritarian practices, because not all practices, even in the environment of authoritarian practices, not all practices are authoritarian. So sometimes political motivation is assigned to the simplest bureaucratic obstacle. And we found this in some of the research we were doing that's in MSF, that's because there's maybe this narrative, the organization develops this narrative that state is against us, they don't like us, they don't want us. Every single thing becomes a political act, even if they're not. So, the customs person being difficult about, providing authorization for the shipment of medicines, or a little problem with visas, or the finance people wanting a little bit more precise figures in the financial reporting or whatever. That becomes assigned as a political, oh, they're out to get us, they're using these practices in order to manipulate us. Sometimes a bureaucratic obstacle is simply a bureaucratic obstacle, and it's not an authoritarian practice. So it's important to know the difference, because often we found this in the research in Kurdistan, that's every single bureaucratic obstacle was there was this narrative that the Kurdistan authorities were against NGOs, and everything was politicized. And so every single piece of paper that was requested was another example and another just proof of the politicization of aid. But it was funny, because when we were talked with at the ministers level in their deal, and we presented them with this idea, they said, no, I don't. They basically said, we don't know where you get this idea, because that's not at all the case. We just have you're just dealing with a bunch of bureaucrats who are acting like bureaucrats. And if you're having trouble with them, just talk to us, and we'll make sure you don't have that trouble anymore, because we want you here. Because what was not understood is this: there is a strategic reason why the Kurdistan authorities wanted NGOs there, and it was because of recognition.
Yeah.
The Kurdistan authorities wanted recognition. Having international NGOs on their territory, even if they weren't actually working on the territory, was very important to them. So they said, that's what's important to us. If you're having bureaucratic problems, it's just because they're bureaucrats.
Yeah.
And so don't think that we're out to get you because the customs person doesn't like you. That has nothing to do with that. And just talk to us, again, the strategic level, just talk to us, negotiate some parameters of action with us at the ministerial level, and you'll have fewer problems with the bureaucrats, because the bureaucrats report to us.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it's just, we tend to overthink things.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody online and here in the room for joining us. We're still got some cookies. We still have a few discount flyers here. So if you want discount in the book, thank you so much for writing the book and doing all the alphas. Thanks again, and see you again. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks, Mahdi. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.